Welcome back to the WNHA Naval Symposium. Up next is our concluding segment for today's session. Entrepreneur Kevin Bertram is the creator of a board game called The Shores of Tripoli. He's going to discuss the process of producing an award-winning war game, as well as what you can learn from actually reenacting history through the rules that he creates with these type of works. So with this, let's welcome Mr. Kevin Bertram.
Thank you. So I want to apologize. My laptop had some issues this morning, so I switched this to my iPad. So I hope everyone's able to access the screen and see it fine. So my name is Kevin Bertram, and I have been a board gamer for quite some time, and I love naval history. And as I'll chat later, I designed the game called The Shores of Tripoli, which is the first Barbary War, 1801 to 1805, foundational event for both the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps. And so I'm here to help chat about that. The framework for today's discussion is basically twofold. One is that board games, I think, are a useful media that we can use to learn about historical events, put ourselves in the shoes of the people making the decisions during those events, how those events could have turned out differently, what all of the different requirements were. So I think I think board games are usually thought of as kids' play or super difficult endeavors. And I think there's a middle ground where I think we can use board games to actually learn about history in general and naval history in particular. And then the second part of the discussion will base around the decisions I made in The Shores of Tripoli and how translating the history into a game that is both educational but enjoyable to play, how that worked out. I'm actually very embarrassed about tooting my own horn, but The Shores of Tripoli was named the best two-player game of the year by New York Magazine. It's won a number of other awards, which frankly surprised me for a historical game because, people don't always, there's certainly sometimes a bit of a bias against history in the society at large. So I'm really proud of that. And I kind of want to walk through what I've done with The Shores of Tripoli. And then also I'll talk about some other things that I'm working on. So, this slide I almost removed for this group, but, we do learn about history through a number of ways. The very first, really, my impression of history was when I was 6 years old and my parents took me to see Midway when it came out in, I think it was 1977, might have been 1976. And I just thought, that was a fantastic movie. It was the first movie I really remember seeing in the theater. And that spurred a huge interest in the Pacific War during World War II, and in particular. And, now that we're being hosted by the USS Midway, I definitely thought it was appropriate to mention that. But then obviously that learning continues, right? We read books. I actually included the cover of my favorite history book from when I was a child. And then, there are documentaries and even novels can impart some, an understanding of both history and its actors. So, but of course, in addition to all those other ways that we can learn about history there are board games. And to understand that board games come from some people, if you say board game, they think, like Monopoly or Clue or Chutes and Ladders. And then other people have a much more, I'd say, sophisticated understanding of board games. My first board game I played was Feudal, which those of you who are a little older might remember as a 3M game that kind of chess-like. And I started playing that when I was 6 with my dad. And that that marriage between history and gaming was always there for me as a young age. So then, you advance to Risk, and then you play Axis and Allies, and even more in-depth games that really spurred, I would say, a lifelong interest in history for me. So that's sort of the perspective that I'm coming from. So I'm actually primarily work in technology. I didn't expect to be a board game designer. And a friend of mine gave me the Brian Kilmeade book, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates. And I kind of rolled my eyes and I was like, fine, I'll read it. And it was a great story. And so I had known only a very little about the First Barbary War. I mean, just the broadest brushes. I don't think we even covered it when I was in high school or in college when I took history classes. And so I did a deep dive on the history, and it's fascinating. I'm sure many of you here have read Six Frigates by Ian Toll, who is really just an amazing writer. But there's, I think I have 30 books on the First Barbary War that, look at it from different perspectives. And it was really an exciting process that when I was designing the game, I definitely wanted to understand as much as I could. Now, some of you may also remember the movie Tripoli with Maureen O'Hara and John Payne. And while it's a hoot to watch, I can't say that the historical record was followed too much in Tripoli. But it reinforces the idea that movies can spur interest in history. I found out recently that Ridley Scott and the Australian actor who's in Gladiator, whose name is Russell Crowe, were actually planning on making a movie about the First Barbary War in the early 2000s, but then things got away. And that's too bad, because that would have been a great movie for people to watch and learn more about the First Barbary War. So I don't know this audience very well. I've only been a member for a year, so I don't know the level of interest in games and historical games in particular. And because we're not in person, I'm sort of speaking blind. So I'm just kind of giving kind of the perspective of games that I've really enjoyed and played, and how I thought they would be helpful for developing a historical game. One of those games is called We the People. It was designed by a gentleman named Mark Herman, and it first introduced what is commonly referred to as a card-driven game, where each player has a hand of cards, and I'll show you some of them later in the presentation. And you are either playing these cards for the event that's on the card, and it might be an event or it might be a person, or you're discarding it to take some other kind of action. And so that was first pioneered in We the People, a game on the American Revolution, which was just groundbreaking at the time. It came out in the early 1990s. So there's some other games that some of you may be familiar with or may not. Twilight Struggle was designed by a good friend of mine, Jason Matthews, and it is a refighting of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And for a long time, it had been the highest rated game on a site called Board Game Geek. And it's truly an impressive game. It really immerses you in that Cold War history and understanding, like, why was Southeast Asia important at certain times? Like, how did the struggle for Europe occur? Like, it's a fascinating learning tool. The games don't always have to be military in nature. I've included 1960, The Making of the President, which is a game that uses this same kind of card-driven system, but instead of being about a military conflict or a conflict, diplomatic conflict between nations, it's instead, of course, a presidential election. This kind of card-driven mechanic in all of these games is really fascinating, and I think it's a way to drive history that before this games just did not do. I've included two other games on here just to give a background. There's a game called Andean Abyss, which was the first in what's called the Coin series, Counterinsurgency series. And that's where there are multiple players. In Andean Abyss, there's 4 players. There's the government, there's the left-wing rebels, the right-wing militia, and then the drug dealers. And they all have, of course, different things they're trying to do in Colombia. And this is set in the 90s or 80s and 90s. And it's a way to model not just a military conflict, but also a political military conflict in the with counterinsurgency going on, with also more traditional military conflict going on, with political conflict going on. And so, games can do a whole bunch of different types of modeling of different types of conflicts and different history. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from. I hope this was helpful, because I just want to try to give folks kind of an overview of where sort of modern historical gaming is at right now. Now, there are some problems with board games for history. The picture up here is actually a long-running joke in the board game industry about a game called the Campaign for North Africa. And it was supposed to take 600 to 800 hours to play. I don't know that everyone has ever actually played it, but it was manufactured in the 80s, and it's sort of it's been, it's made fun of on different television shows, and it's sort of everything that was wrong with trying to use games as historical educational tools. The rules are super complex. There's lots of pieces. There are these little small cardboard counters, which, although that appeals to me, that's certainly not something that a new gamer would appeal to a new gamer. Multiple hours to play, and also just widely off history. That's not necessarily a criticism of the Campaign for North Africa, but earlier on, I think you all saw a picture of Axis and Allies, which is a World War II game, and a common result of that game would be Japanese tanks would be liberating Moscow from the Germans, and that's a little bit outside of probably a realistic scenario of what would happen in World War II, but it's a common scenario in what happens in that game. So, for games to be both fun but also educational, we definitely need to have some design parameters around that. So this is the front and back of the Shores of Tripoli, and I'll go into quite a bit of detail, but there are sort of some main discussions that I had when I was designing the game. And if anyone here is interested in game design, I'm not super familiar with the audience. These are kind of the main questions that you need to go through. And I've listed them all out here so you can see, but I'm going to actually just go through them. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And actually, sorry about that. First, I want to tell you how to play. So Shores of Tripoli is a card-driven board game where each player has a deck of cards, and they draw a certain number of cards, 6 in this case, every year. And then they play those cards to move ships, go on pirate raids, receive reinforcements, engage in diplomacy, and all of the different options that they can have in the game. The game uses dice to resolve combat, which is pretty traditional for war games. Some people don't like the luck involved in it, but storms come up and military victories are never a sure thing. So dice is definitely I thought the best way to model combat in the game. It's designed as it's a two-sided game. So the United States is played by one player, and they have both Swedish and then some local Arab allies, and also some mercenary allies. And then the other side is the Pasha of Tripoli, and he has allies or potential allies in Morocco, Tangier, and Morocco, Algiers, and Tunis. So, and so the game is traditionally played as a two-player game, but there are rules that it can be played solitaire, where you play as the Americans, and a bot called the T-bot plays as Tripoli, and the game lasts about 45 to 60 minutes. So this might seem a little strange that I put components up so high in the discussion of how to design the game, but it was actually really important to me. If you think at most games that you would buy at, I guess not Toys R Us anymore, but at Walmart or Target, they're pretty low quality and they're seen as kids things. And I think there was a period of time in this country where chess was definitely well respected. Backgammon for a while was well respected, and part of that is that the components were so nice. I mean, a really nice chessboard, a really nice backgammon board was something like, it looked adult. And so that was sort of the notion that I wanted with Tripoli, is that it didn't look like a child's toy, but yet it would still be accessible to both, children who wanted to play, or older children, but definitely for adults as well. And so that was kind of the thesis that I went in on this. So if you can tell, the board is it's mounted. It's on a thick mounting. It's a picture, of the Mediterranean. You track the years and the seasons. lots of dice, lots of pieces. The larger ships that you see there are frigates, and then there's some smaller ships that you'll see that are either corsairs for Tripoli and hit their allies, or gunboats for the United States. And then there's the cards that drive the game. So here's just a little closer up. So you can see these cards, and so I'm gonna, on the left side, you see a card called Sweden Pays Tribute. And so this was a way to take the history of what happened and integrate it into the game. So Sweden had actually been at war with Tripoli since 1800. When we arrived, we worked with them, although it wasn't stellarly successful, but we were working together to try and stop Tripoli. We were under some interesting constraints initially, so we kind of deferred to the Swedes, and then they eventually just got fed up. Their frigates were a little deeper draft. They weren't great for the blockading. They had lost a ship to a storm earlier, and so eventually they just decided to pay Tripoli off. They would pay tribute to Tripoli, and they would leave the game. And so that's what this card is right here. Sweden Pays Tribute. So as the Tripolitan player, you would get gold from the Swedish player, or from the American player, and the Swedish ships would leave the game. On the right, we see a pretty important historical battle, the Battle of Dern. It's where actually To the Shores of Tripoli comes from the Marine Corps hymn. There wasn't actually ground fighting in Tripoli. The ground fighting was in a city called Dern, which is in eastern, well, now Libya, then Tripolitania. And so so you'll see that there's some ships that are bombarding, helping the land forces, and that one blue cube is the Marine Corps, and then the handful of Marine units that were there. I think it was 6 men plus a naval, plus one Navy guy, plus a Marine lieutenant. And then there's the white cubes there represent the Arab allies and some Greek mercenaries and a hodgepodge of other troops that were assisting the United States. So, and then the two cards there, one of those cards, General Eaton attacks. General Eaton attacks Dern is the one that you would play to attack Dern, and and then you would move your troops in and attack. And so that's how you're using these cards that I'll continue to. I should have probably structured this a little bit differently, but that's how you use cards to move. So we also wanted to make sure that the game was educational. And a lot of that comes from the gameplay, and that you're learning what the goals were for each side. You're learning what the resources they had available, the actions that they could take. But, when you're playing a game, it's still, unless you're familiar with it helps to be a little familiar with what actually happened. And so included in the game were two things. The first was an original document. I mean, we recreated this, but it was a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Basha of Tripoli. And it was, pretty heavy fisted diplomacy that failed. And we went to war with them in 1801. But then we also included a 12-page booklet that includes the history of the Barbary War. It was written by a professor at George Mason University. She her PhD was on the first Barbary War, and so she distilled down the important facts that someone who wasn't really familiar with the conflict could definitely get an understanding of it. But then we also include a bibliography of several books that would recommend, and so this is a way to pair the enjoyment of playing the game, but also the education of learning how to play, or learning what the conflict is about. So I've been talking about the cards quite a bit, and I want to apologize. I probably should have structured this a little bit differently. I'd originally structured this for people who are very familiar with card-driven games. And so, like I say, I apologize for that. But here's a list of what some of the cards are. So the first three cards are from the American deck, where the first card is where we created Hamet's army, who was the older brother of the Basha of Tripoli, that we were thinking about putting him on the throne, and he would be more amenable to not engaging in piracy against us, and we would not have to pay tribute to him. And so that like that's a way that these cards would be able to bring in something that historically happened, so then you can model in the game. I should probably step back and talk about the mechanic in particular. So when you have a hand of cards, as the American player, you can either play the card as the event, or you can discard it. And if you discard it, you can move ships, or you can engage in diplomacy to fundamentally to build a gunboat, having one of the smaller Italian states give you the materials or give you gunboats. The Tripolitan player, what they can do is they can either play a card for an event, or they can discard a card to go raiding with their fleet, or they can acquire another Corsair. And so there's always a balance of trying to keep your fleet at the optimum size, but balancing that out with action. So another really important choice was play balance. And part of that play balance was deciding what the winning conditions would be. So the first Barbary War, the United States, very new nation, not a lot of respect in Europe, definitely no respect from the Barbary states. We were already paying Algiers something like a quarter of our national budget in tribute. And, now Tripoli wanted, even more. And so that's what spurred this war. So what's really important is that, a lot of games are just like take more territory to win. And I wanted the way to win in the game to be more finely tuned to the historical setting that both sides had. So the United States could win in one of two ways, and they're represented by these two cards. And one is that was the historical result, in that they could force Tripoli to sign the Treaty of Peace and Amity, where they would agree we wouldn't have to pay them tribute. We would pay them a small ransom for some sailors that they had imprisoned, and we would, not be at peace. And that is the historical result. And we only reached that result because we had done a number of things. We had started up this Hamet's army, threatening to put his brother on the throne. We had isolated them from their potential allies. Their fleet had been battered. They had captured one of our frigates, the Philadelphia, and then we snuck in and destroyed it, which was, a major part of the war. I mean, it's a major event that occurs. And so we had sort of, and our blockade had been very successful. So they basically gave up, and that's the historical result. But I wanted the players to be able to explore other options. So the other option is where we actually do assault Tripoli, and we try to put the Basha the Basha's brother on the throne, and his name is Hamet, and then that would be a regime change and a little bit earlier than historically we started doing that. And so that's an option that the player, that the American player has. Similarly, the way the Tripolitan player wins is by making the cost in either blood or treasure too high for the United States. So the Tripolitan player could win by just successfully pirate raiding. 12 gold is what the standard is in the game, and that would reflect that our blockade was just completely inadequate. They continue to pirate our merchant ships, so it's cheaper to pay them off. Or if the U.S. player, if the Tripolitan player sinks 4 of the U.S. player's frigates, then that would just be, the cost would be too high to our Navy, and therefore we would concede. Or if they were to eliminate our land forces, and so if the Marines and Hamet's army were wiped out, then we would also probably sue for peace. So it was So the goal was to put the real historical considerations and what winning conditions would be for both sides, embed those into the game. And then the notion was that, all right, now we have these winning conditions, and each side should have a fairly reasonable shot at victory, right? It's no fun to play a game if one side is going to win. And so there was a lot of play effort that went into making sure that there was a pretty good balance. In designing a game, there's obviously a tension between playability and realism. And I think a good example of that is the U.S. frigates in the game. So, the 6 frigates and plus the Philadelphia and another frigate that had been built outside of 6 frigates, they varied widely in ship design. Some had 44 guns, some had 36 guns, some were a little bit longer. We also had some schooners and sloops that, we had a diverse Navy. It wasn't that all of the ships were the same, but for purposes of the game, that doesn't really matter, right? A frigate is going to shoot with 2 dice and take 2 hits to sink, and a smaller ship can only shoot with 1 dice and 1 tip. So there was this kind of standardization that would occur to make the game more playable, even if it obscures some of the more detailed reality. Similarly, logistics are only handled at a very high level. There was a plague going on, and during that time in parts, and there's lots of quarantine going on, and that's all kind of brushed out, and so that you focus on the high level events of the game. I'm not sure why I used this image here with this tagline, but this shows an evolution of what the cards looked like as the development process went. As you'll notice, that's just a playing card and some printed paper for a naval movement card, and then the next one was, a little bit iteration of that. And then that final one, although it's a little dark in this picture, that's what a card would look like. So now, if the same side won all the time, or if it followed history, then, the United States would always win. And so this is kind of another spot where there's a tension between the actual history and then allowing the players some agency to engage in an alternate history. And so that these cards reflect that and in the historical booklet, I also actually call out each card that actually did not happen but could have happened. And so, for example, when our fleet landed in Gibraltar, there were some Tripolitan corsairs there. We weren't even sure if we were at war with Tripoli yet, and so there's some subterfuge that occurs, and these corsairs, and we end up asking the British to confiscate them, and that's what happens. But there is an alternative that they might break out and try to get to Tripoli. So that first card there, Murad Reis breaks out, is an option for Tripoli to have those extra ships. Tunis never declared war on the United States. We continued to pay during the war. We continued to pay tribute to Algiers, and then Tangiers, Morocco, declared war on us for a short period of time. They captured 1 ship, and then we sent a pretty big fleet in, and they reconsidered declaring war and insisted it was a mistake. But you still want to have all of the allies available to Tripoli, and so Tunis declares war. That's another example of an alternate history card. Obviously, an assault on Tripoli never occurred, but we want to let that be an option as well. And so send in the Marines, and there's a handful of other cards that reflect that alternate history to give players agency in playing. Another thing is that, so playtesting was extremely important. You'll notice these are not the final products, and in fact, there are all kinds of difference. These were pictures that playtesters took and posted. I actually ended up having over 300 people playtest the game, and that was really helpful, because not only did I get a lot of feedback about how people, did this work, did these rules make sense? Are you learning about the history? But also to make sure that the gameplay was balanced, and that was vitally important. And this community was created who, now the same people who play tested the Shores of Tripoli are all now volunteering to play test the Halls of Montezuma, which is my next game, which is of course on the Mexican-American War. So, and in fact, if anybody was interested in play testing, by all means, reach out to me and I can send you a play test kit. So what I want a person to learn from coming away from playing Tripoli is a couple things. Is first, who are the major actors? Who are the major events? Obviously Yusuf Karamanli is the leader of Tripoli. You should be aware of him. There are several naval officers who people should be aware of. Decatur, Decatur, Preble. Presley O'Bannon was, of course, the Marine lieutenant who led forces at the Battle of Dern. And so those like those names should now have, some kind of meaning. Also, the major events, which I would say was Sweden's involvement and then leaving the creation of Hamet's army and the plan to overthrow the existing Shores of Tripoli, the Philadelphia running aground and Tripoli capturing it, and then the resulting raid that we engaged in to blow it up was a major event. And so, having these kind of the major and also major events, people were aware of it. Also, the diplomatic situation. I mean, it's sometimes we forget that the United States was not always wasn't always the top dog. And indeed, at this time, we weren't even sure if we wanted to have a Navy. And so only because I would say, because of the Closet War with France, did it really solidify that, yes, we do need a Navy. And so, our relationship with Britain was actually fairly good at this time, although we would, declare war on them shortly, 6 years later. Our partnership with Sweden, the Ottoman Empire, was, backing the Barbary states, at least at some level. And then also the asymmetrical nature of the conflict. The idea that, I probably shouldn't call them pirates, right? Tripoli was just engaged. I mean, this is a state authorized Navy that was just engaging in the way their economy ran, which was based on a combination of piracy and tribute and slavery by capturing people and also holding hostage sailors that they captured. And so that was what their economy was based on. And that's obviously a very different perspective than the Americans, who were focused on free trade and wanted to see our economy develop through that way. So we had very different perspectives. The two nations had very different perspectives on the conflict and what the goals were, and that it's important to me that comes through in the game. So definitely not trying to make this promotional, but we do have some more games in the pipeline, and they're on pretty different subjects. So Votes for Women is designed by a friend of mine, and I'm developing, and these cards come from that game, and it follows the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The game begins in 1848 and goes through 1920 when the 19th Amendment was actually ratified by the states. The United States versus Aaron Burr is the treason trial of Aaron Burr, which is a fascinating story. And in fact, some of the characters from the first Barbary War are then in as witnesses or play a part in that trial. And so it's pretty wild. I mean, it's just, everybody who's anybody is involved in that trial in some way. First Monday in October is about the history and evolution of the Supreme Court by looking at how major cases get affected by who's on the court and the lobbying that goes on. That's designed by a woman who brought the game to us, and it's fantastic. I'm not as knowledgeable about it, but we're putting it together, and I've played it a couple times. It's pretty fantastic. And then the Halls of Montezuma is the sibling game for the Shores of Tripoli. So I think that there's an opportunity outside of just naval history, but for using cards that integrate people and events and what's occurring in a situation to be fantastic educational tools, and not just educational, but also enjoyable. And so I hope that helped. I really hope next year that I can actually be at the conference, because it'd be nice to be able to chat with people and know what their interests are. But I hope this was helpful. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Throw it open.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. This is a fascinating insight into another area of expression of history, particularly naval history. And we do have a question from Samson Grady. He really would like to know, where did you obtain all the material for your illustrations in your lavishly illustrated game?
Oh, well, so I was very lucky. The Navy, I live in Washington, D.C., and so the Navy, down at the Navy Yard, they have the historical group down there that were super helpful. The Mariners Museum in Newport News it was super helpful. They had a lot of these documents scanned in. The U.S. Naval Academy Museum was helpful, as was the National Museum of the Marine Corps. So I'd say all four of those groups were just super helpful. And because they're all older paintings, they're all public domain, which was very helpful for me. The one exception is actually the cover of the game. That picture was from the Maine Historical Society, and we made a small donation to them to be able to use it as the cover painting. But yeah, we were really blessed that everyone was so helpful, and I thank all those folks in the booklet.
Can I ask you a question, Kevin? This is Vince O'Hara.
Sure.
We've been playing the game, my son and I, and do you have any comments about a blockade strategy as opposed to a battle strategy? He's been taking the American frigates into the Tripoli and attacking them every turn.
So yes, I'm definitely happy to give some strategy hints. So I would say that when people first play the game, they think that Tripoli has a little bit of advantage because learning how to win as the Americans takes a little bit of time, whereas Tripoli is straightforward. There's like, we're going to pirate raid, and then if things get bad, we're going to start defending. And so some American players just give up on the blockade pretty early, and they try to just really go after the size of the Tripolitan fleet. And so to counter that, as Tripoli, you need to keep your fleet size big enough before you start raiding. Because if you're down to like 4 or 3 Corsairs and he comes with 2 or 4 frigates at you, like just the imbalance of the dice, he's going to have a pretty big advantage. But so if you can keep your fleet at like a minimum of 6 or 7 Corsairs, which means probably your first turn or two, you discard a card to build a Corsair, or if you have the card that allows you to build 2 Corsairs, if you can get those 2 Corsairs from Gibraltar to Tripoli immediately. I mean, whatever you can do to get your fleet big enough, so then it's a disincentive to have that strategy, which is, part of the back and forth. And then he will need to counter your strategy of doing that, and you'll need to counter that strategy. So, that's the way. Now, does he still attack Dern, or does he try to just send in Marines only to capture Tripoli?
Usually, you have to capture Dern in order to play the treaty card, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead. Here's my son.
Oh, hello. Yeah, I'm Vincent Jr.
How's it going?
Good. How about you? Yeah. So your game's really good. I think it's really well balanced, actually. It took a while to get the hang of it, but once we did, I think the Americans and Tripolitanians win by about 50-50.
About 50-50.
The only thing I never use when I play Americans, I never use the attack Tripoli card because the other cards is way more optimal. So I never have any reason to want to play the attack on Tripoli.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because then I had play testers who would never. They said it was too hard to, because you got to keep the allies down, and also a very experienced Tripolitan player will keep 1 or 2 of their allies out and not play those cards early on in the game. So if they play them much later in the game, then you need to have a show of force, or God forbid, pay tribute to bribe them out, or you're going to have to keep attacking those allies to eliminate them so you can play the treaty card. So I prefer playing for the treaty, but it's definitely there's things that the Tripolitan player can do to make you have to go for the win. And also, if you get bad luck on the Philadelphia, because once you take Dern, the Tripolitan player is going to immediately play aid from Constantinople. So that means they're going to get a frigate that way, so you can't play the treaty card. And if they had captured the Philadelphia, that means they're going to have 2 frigates, and they're going to obviously bide their time to try to not not lose them both, right? And you need to eliminate them. Now you have 2 cards that have a chance to eliminate them, but you need to have some pretty good rolls to make sure you wipe out his frigates. So
yeah, one of the reasons why I asked the question was just to demonstrate that there is quite a bit of subtlety in the game. I kind of broke my teeth on naval wargaming with miniatures and with cardboard pieces and very complex rules. And there's some sort of disrespect, if you will, of the card-driven systems. And this is one of the first card-driven war games that I've ever played, and I have been very impressed with the all the strategic subtleties and all the different paths that you can follow in the game. And there's a lot of it depends on what card you draw when, obviously, but there's much more to the game than I had originally anticipated. So
Yeah, and the thing is I've been really pleased with reviewers who have played a couple games and then they're like, oh, this game's amazing. But like someone plays it once and they're like, oh, this is going to be the same game every time. And so I'm glad people, take the time to realize that's the case, that there is some subtlety and some, strategy and counter strategies that occurs in the game.
it takes time to learn the strategies. Yeah, that's true.
We have a question from Leonard Heinz. He'd like to know that with 300 playtesters, how did you manage the playtesting process? And in designing the game, how did you decide at which level to pitch the point of view? For example, the U.S. at the level of the national government or the local commander, or what?
Those are two excellent questions. So I'm actually going to talk about the playtesting first the playtesting. So I actually learned a lot. And initially, I handled that all by email. So people were sending me email results, and I was pulling them out and tallying them. And then when I was seeing people in person before the pandemic, I had a notebook where I would keep track of every game I observed in person and would be making notes. And I could see the trend of wins and losses. And if I changed a couple cards, I could see how that would change how the results were going. And I wanted to make sure, there was diversity in how long the game was taking, how people were winning, right? So, and that was actually really a pain, like you would not believe. And so I've done it a little differently this time for the Halls of Montezuma. And I built just a Google Doc that people fill out the results. And obviously we have some email conflict all then. And so there's both what year did it end? Who won? How did they win? What was the game state? And then some open-ended questions about, was this fun? Did the rules make sense? Questions like that. But then I follow up individually and ask people all right, well, I'm thinking about the Halls of Montezuma right now, because that's what I'm really been focused on is all right, does it make sense to have a fort in both Veracruz and in Mexico City? Does that imbalance, or does it make the Mexican army too passive? Whereas they were more aggressive than probably most players are. How do we balance that? And so, that's a process that you continue to go through and back and forth. The other question I think is a fantastic question. And the truth is I sort of stumbled to it. I realized I wanted it to be high level. And so you could see the diplomacy. It wasn't the minutia of the ships. I mean, there's definitely combat, and the combat is important, and certain actors are important. But I didn't want it to be just about a battle. I wanted it to be, because I was thinking about the game for the classroom. Not that be its only venue, but one venue. And so I was like, well, if you're teaching the first Barbary War and you want to play a game in 45 to 60 minutes, what are the important actions that need to be conveyed? And then what is the perspective of who is acting on those actions? And so, the American player is kind of a combination of, the Secretary of the Navy / the president, and then the commanders on the scene, right? And so it's kind of amorphous. And then as Tripoli, you're definitely the Basha and his command, and your commanders. And so that sort of was just the default. It just worked out, and I didn't really think about it as much as I probably should have, but I think it worked out. For the Halls of Montezuma, I actually put a lot more thought into that question, and the gameplays, it has some similarities with the Shores of Tripoli, but there's also a political phase. And so the United States is trying to win by forcing Mexico to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. the Mexican side can win by either outlasting the United States to the end of 1848, so Polk's no longer president, or that the United States support for the war goes to, well, zero in the game. It would be like whatever that would reflect in real life. And so really in that game, the American player is the Polk administration, and the Mexican player is really the Mexican government, but also the anti-war movement in the United States. And so that kind of joint political and military perspective, which really isn't that much a part of the First Barbary War, is certainly an important part of the Mexican-American War. And I know we just had 2 presentations on the war in Vietnam. Really, you could see the Mexican-American War. I mean, obviously, there's lots of differences. I don't mean to belabor the analogy, but is that it is a battle between the United States reaching its goal before the political will to support that war erodes. And so that's sort of the perspective I'm taking on the Mexican-American War in the Halls of Montezuma, and the kind of the high level who you are when you're playing the game.
All right. Are there any other questions or observations about this fascinating process of developing a historically minded game and bringing it to market? Well, Kevin, we'd like to thank you for this fascinating presentation, and hope that others will be able to take up your product and be able to incorporate it in their own pastimes on expressing history. So thank you very much for attending.
Great. Thank you very much. I can't wait to be there next year.